Good afternoon. My name is Ted Davey. It's my privilege today to introduce our guest speaker, John Schmidt, a fellow Albertan now living and speaking to us from Australia. The invitation bio gave details of what he has been doing and where since graduating in 1977. I noted he had specialized in physiological psychology, which was unknown to me. So I Googled and Googled, trying to find the connection with his work in intelligence. I found it maybe both definitions of intelligence, that is the ability to acquire and apply knowledge in order to interpret the information collected of military or potential value. Then I read John's summary for today's presentation in the invitation and was curious, then intrigued, perhaps baffled. However, reading from some of his earlier publications, I found these helpful explanations. He wrote, I quote, "Intelligence involves both analysis and synthesis. Analysis produces facts and conclusion. Synthesis produces coherent assessments of these facts and conclusions," unquote. In another publication, he wrote, quote, "While also using analytic tools and techniques, foresight far more greatly relies on those directed at synthesizing results from a wide range of data, perspectives, and interpretations. Good foresight is thus fundamentally and almost entirely a process of disciplined synthesizing from a range of more focused mindsets, assumptions, and approaches in the context of high uncertainty. It uses different inputs and views to challenge and bring out the best from one another toward achieving a result that all can understand and embrace and use." Today, I'm counting on John to clarify this subject for me, explaining how he is able to apply synthesis and foresight to anticipate and address the future more reliably in a way that even I may understand. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Ted. So my presentation today is not so much about particular solutions, but about key ingredients required to get to them. And I'll follow two interweaving threads, as Ted indicated, on foresight and synthesis. Interweaving because they're both required, and it's really hard to talk about foresight while excluding synthesis. Now, consider this statement. The past and present are known, but the future is not. Is that true? We're going to run a quick poll and see what you think. And the answers are yes, no, unsure. Please answer them as quickly as you can so we can see the results of our poll. And when he has enough answers in the poll, Alf will share the results. There we go. So 31% say true, 50% say false, and 19% unsure. That's a good mix. And let's see how the rest of the talk goes on this. But in fact, I'll let you in on a little secret. This is a false statement. The latter half is true, but the first part is not. And no matter how much data we have, no matter how many measurements we take, no matter how many heads we have trying to get their heads around it, we do not know all of the past and the present. And in fact, a lot of what we think we know may be incorrect. Now, for the rest of the discussion, we need a starting point. So let's begin with the major catastrophic, even existential, what people call threats, risks, challenges to humanity, or at least to our civilization. You've heard previously from Julian Cribb in his writing and speaking, especially in his book, Surviving the 21st Century, Julian talks about 10 catastrophic risks. All these risks interact with one another, meaning they cannot be tackled separately or solved one by one. Collectively, they're driven by human overpopulation, overconsumption, and overpollution. So the risks are extinction and eco collapse, currently proceeding 1,000 to 10,000 times faster than normal, eliminating the ecosystems that humans and wildlife need to survive. Overheating, climate approaching out of control as nine huge feedbacks from the Earth system itself make it even faster, hotter, and more turbulent. Global poisoning, nuclear holocaust, resource scarcity. World water crisis is already a reality for half the population. Loss of topsoil, forests, fish stocks, and scarcity of other key resources threaten to unleash fresh conflicts. Pandemics, overpopulation. We hit 8 billion and we're on our way to even more. Famine and hunger. Ultra technologies. And the last one, misinformation. We're drowning in lies, half-truths, and disinformation, mainly spread by the fossil fuel lobby, but certainly other media, politicians, and malicious actors. How does our decision-making work in that kind of environment? So, of these, much of the political press and popular focus these days is on climate change, obviously with not everyone on the same side of the discussion. It's clear that already many countries that are least responsible for climate change and least able to deal with its consequences are also the ones suffering its greatest effects, leading to the catchphrase climate inequality. However, many places much closer to home, in Australia, Canada, and elsewhere, are also heavily affected. And I think it's fair to say it won't be long before we all are. The direct consequences of climate change and other such factors are increasing and spreading water, food, and other resource insecurities. These in turn are leading to mass migrations and other consequences. Along with these, we have several compounding factors: global disparities, many violent conflicts around the world, potentially leading us to a catastrophic war between major powers, increasing misinformation and disinformation and its influences, competing and even opposing interests and agencies blocking solutions, and so on. Worst of all, there is no shared plan in place to address them. The Delivering of Human Futures conference concluded that all of humanity faces a common existential emergency which threatens our civilization and possibly our very existence. It consists of a wide range of interconnected threats which cannot be addressed one at a time for fear of making the others worse. They must be addressed systematically with integrated and well-planned solutions across the board. We don't even have the right measures in place at the national and global policy level to guide effective decision-making. And there's a fundamental need to re-engineer our measures of social and economic health. Continuous economic growth is a problem. In particular, we need to change our simple measure of GDP to measures related to well-being. Now, since the origin of this characterization I'm going to put up in the mid-80s, we've referred to our world as being volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, or VUCA. To these, I would add dangerous, making the acronym VUCAD. And it certainly is dangerous, as we've just seen, with all the threatening possibilities we face. So much so that the danger is to our civilization and to most, if not all, humans. It's existential. While it's an option often included in policy paper, we cannot do anything. We cannot not do anything and hope to get through the coming period relatively unscathed. And running around with our hands waving in the air and yelling that the sky is falling gets us no further. We must act in global concert if we want to avert or minimize the effects of these threats. So what do? The two most problematic factors in this vocad condition or framework are uncertainty and complexity, because they make finding and executing solutions far more difficult. So let's look at the nature of risk, as we generally use the term. ISO 31000, with which you may be familiar, it's not a great read, but it's there, defines risk as the effect of uncertainty on objectives. However, current practice, as illustrated in ISO 31000, generally formulates risk as a function of these two major factors, likelihood and consequences, in a manner that suggests methodologies for estimating or even calculating risk. However, given the accepted definition, we should recognize and formally include uncertainty as the third major factor. And to be clear, uncertainty is not somehow already considered as part of the likelihood assessment. Likelihood and uncertainty are two very different factors. So how does what we don't know affect the risk analysis? Dealing with uncertainty is really what risk analysis is all about. It may, in fact, be the most significant risk factor, especially because it's often overlooked or ignored. Certainly, overtly including uncertainty as an actual risk factor is not often done. The worst type of uncertainty is that which is not acknowledged, though through either ignorance or willful blindness. It can totally defeat the risk analysis and dependent decisions. So we really need to identify as much of what we don't know as possible. Some uncertainties can be addressed by obtaining and analyzing further information, but others must simply be identified and accepted as gaps, at least for the present. So here's an illustration of how the likelihood and consequences factors combine to produce a risk product. This is blue, variably shaded area. And now let's show the amount of uncertainty for each factor as red error bars, if you will. And these can, of course, vary relative to each of the other two factors. Including the uncertainty variables produces a range between the dashed lines for the risk product. The actual risk could be as small as within the inner dashed line or as large as the outer one. This, of course, adds to the problem faced by the decision maker in deciding how to respond to the risk. Complexity greatly compounds the uncertainty factor and therefore the risk. So complexity. In the past, problems and challenges faced by governments, their agencies, private sector organizations, and individuals could legitimately be seen and treated as being merely complicated, originating from isolated causes that were clearly identifiable and falling within distinct bureaucratic responsibilities. They could be dissected into isolated chunks, addressed, and pieced back together. Consequences were generally proportionate to their causes. And for every input, there was a proportionate output. Fixtures could be put in place for permanent solutions. However, today's problems are in fact increasingly complex, which has great implications for the way we understand issues and organize policy and planning responses. Complex, or what's often called wicked problems, involve concurrent interactions among events across multiple dimensions of governance and multiple systems of events. They have no regard for our customary jurisdictional and bureaucratic boundaries. They cannot be broken apart and solved piece by piece. And rather than stabilizing into permanent solutions, they morph into new problems that have to be continually managed. One result of this is that essentially nothing is linear. There are no straight lines, but squiggly ones interacting with others and sometimes doing very unpredicted things. Much of my university education was in the analytics and science arena. Much of my career, especially the latter part, was in the intelligence arena, as Ted mentioned. I tend to see problems through those lenses, especially intelligence, and see through those lenses as ideally mutually analogous in their striving for objectivity, truth, and understanding. So I will use the term intelligence as a more generic term during my presentation, hopefully without offending anyone. We can discuss that later. So the role of intelligence is to inform decision makers, especially with respect to their risk management roles. And done well, the intelligence function produces specific, fact-based, and reasoned answers to specific questions for specific audiences. And every organization, every decision maker in both the public and private sectors should have or have access to effective intelligence in some form or its equivalent for the organization to prosper. And so going back to our starting point today, we certainly have a great deal of intelligence or the equivalent about the current and emerging existential threats we face. And as you know, some countries, national security apparatus have begun to include intelligence coverage of some of the threats we've identified. And here is a basic intelligence process represented as a linear sequence of events, starting with some combination of these things. And it's essentially a single circuit of what we call the intelligence cycle, generally how it seems to an analyst doing the work. So taking our lead from the definition on the previous slide, then, the fundamental nature of intelligence analysis is the methodical and reasoned winnowing of apparent facts to determine, assemble, and synthesize from those that survive certain tests, and identify and try to fill gaps, and then draw logical judgments and assess them and their implications for both the present and the future. At its best, intelligence analysis can produce not only an effective description of what has happened or is happening, plus a logical, credible, and testable explanation for those facts, but also predictions of what else might be occurring in the area for which information is sparse, and especially forecasts or estimates of where it is all going. In other words, the what, so what, and now what, as they put it. So putting intelligence together with policy and planning in the context, we start with what we might call the reality space, where we find the real and believed to be real things, events and conditions that affect our existence. Then we have what we can call the decision space, where we determine our approach and strategies. Past and present reality is the basis for our perception of what is, as reflected in policy decisions, and has in many cases tended to be bound by those decisions, especially the apparently more immediate ones. When we identify the decision space function more completely as policy and planning, perhaps, we must bring to bear the probable, predictable portion of that reality space and expand our consideration to include both what is likely and what is intended. The work and decisions of policy and planning are appropriately informed by analysis within the information and analysis space. Intelligence is the primary function responsible for informing the policy and planning functions about the past, present, and probable predictable parts of the reality space. Descriptive and explanatory intelligence inform policy and planning on what is or is believed to be fact about the past and present. And intelligence also informs policy and planning on what is likely, what is probable or predictable based on its analysis and assessment of available factual information, including forecasting future state and warning of threats or opportunities. This is essentially how the current system generally operates when it is considered to be operating well. Now, here's a relationship of uncertainty or the unknown to the intelligence process, which very much prefers to assess or judge on the basis of known knowns or facts, held information that feeds directly into answering the intelligence question. Some of you may see echoes of a fellow by the name of Rumsfeld in this. So then we have the known unknowns, information identified as relevant but not yet held, generally that which is included in an intelligence collection plan. Then we have unknown knowns, something that Rumsfeld left out. This is held information not yet recognized or remembered for its relevance to the intelligence question. And finally, unknown unknowns, information gaps not yet identified. So the big question there is, how do you identify them in the first place? How do you know what you don't know? You can see the progression from one box to another by changing something unknown to known. In the first case, from known unknowns to known knowns, it's fairly straightforward. From unknown knowns, it's also, if people pay attention, if people actually ask the right questions, possible to do. But unknown unknowns, there's a problem there. So the intelligence function faces some constant challenges. And this is a conclusion of the United States National Intelligence Council in its Global Trends 2030 Alternative Worlds. It was produced in 2012. So the intelligence community across the world recognizes that the future is not set in stone, and that they don't have all the information. So intelligence by itself cannot consistently produce prediction or warning, no matter how effective it is. This is not a criticism, but a reality. Intelligence functions depend on the presence of sufficient testable facts, and this is both their strength and their weakness. Intelligence alone does not cope well with uncertainty, especially when compounded with high complexity, except at best to indicate as clearly as possible where identifiable uncertainty exists and its boundaries. Intelligence does not do well to speculate, to guess, as a means of bypassing uncertainty. Speculation as part of an intelligence product is not often well received by decision makers. It requires something else to better ensure its success in detecting, recognizing, and assessing events and trends, and in successfully communicating relevant information to decision makers. On top of this, and in spite of all this uncertainty and complexity, it often seems that decision makers are consciously or unconsciously wearing blinkers and ignore, or don't appreciate the relevance of the wider context. There is therefore a need to establish a means to achieve better awareness, early warning, and appreciation of the consequences of that context, and to find ways to help decision makers challenge their assumptions, focus on outcomes, and ask questions like, what if? Now here's a version of what is called the futures cone, which I'm sure you've seen before in various contexts, showing the progression from the present, as we perceive it, towards different kinds of futures. shown simplistically here for the most part as concentric cones. It distinguishes 4 regions of potential futures. Probable futures contains those that are considered likely to happen and stem in part from the continuation of current trends as we see them. Plausible futures encompass those that could happen according to our current knowledge of how things work. They're not excluded by our current understanding of physical laws, processes, causation, etc. Possible futures includes all the kinds of futures we can imagine, as well as those beyond current imagination, those which might happen, no matter how far-fetched, unlikely, or way out. They might involve transgression of currently accepted physical laws or principles, or be reliant on the existence of some knowledge we do not yet possess in order to come about. Then there's the preferable future, which is, by contrast, what we want to happen. It derives from our value judgments. The preferable or preferred future can lie in or across any of the previous 3 regions. And finally, we have scenarios depicted as regions in the plausible zone and wildcards, low probability events, or mini scenarios, which, if they occurred, would have very high impact. The missing ingredient in this discussion so far is, of course, foresight. You've heard previously about this from people like David Harries and Reuben Nelson. Some of what I say will overlap with some of theirs, but I anticipate that some will be new. Foresight is a necessary discipline complementary to intelligence and its analogs. It enhances both an agency's ability to perform its intelligence functions and the capacity of the agency's decision makers to appreciate and act on that intelligence. The term foresight is often misused and misunderstood in both intelligence and management discussions. It's important to distinguish foresight from intelligence analysis to develop a better understanding of how it can complement and support the latter. Foresight is the disciplined analysis of alternative futures. It is not prediction, it is not vision, and it's not intelligence. It is a distinct set of tools and processes that address the complex or even wicked context in monitoring prospective oncoming events, analyzing potential implications, simulating alternative courses of action, asking unasked questions, and issuing timely warning to avert or deal with a threat or seize an opportunity. An organized foresight generating system can help organizations detect weak signals and emergent trends, visualize and appreciate the implications of alternative futures, and simulate actions that would otherwise have to be tested against reality, where the costs are much greater and the consequences of error are irrevocable. There certainly is an appreciation for something called foresight in the public sector, particularly in relation to security and technology issues. Some areas of the private sector have also sought to use foresight. However, it is too often resolved to be nothing more than a demand for an adamant expectation of an accurate, narrow prediction of what is going to happen. As well, there are many people running around calling themselves futurists, but who do not practice the foresight discipline. Rather, they tout themselves as just better prognosticators. Governments, public sector organizations, and increasingly private sector organizations must see beyond what can be predicted, correctly or incorrectly, and therefore need genuine foresight to help them do these things. So let's go back to this graphic and expand reality space to include all plausible things, including those which may not be predictable, but which are within the realm of things that can happen. And this takes the policy and planning context from what is and what is likely or intended to what if. We look to foresight to inform policy and planning about the plausible to provide a very important context for the conversation between intelligence and policy and planning. And the very strong relationship between foresight and intelligence functions allows them to inform and learn from each other. And finally, we have the possible or imaginable segment of our reality space. And this is generally the realm of science or speculative fiction. This does not directly feed into the decision space, but is filtered through the foresight function, for which it can be a rich source of ideas. Who remembers Star Trek and all those early science fiction programs and films and the things that they included that are now commonplace? So all of this serves to support resiliency in policy and planning processes, especially with respect to risk management. Here's the same set of relationships shown more as a system. Intelligence looks to the horizon with specific questions. And I want you to note that the horizon is both near and far. When we talk about the future horizon, we could be talking about the next second, or even something that's happening now we don't recognize. Foresight also looks to the horizon, but with broader questions, including what if? Foresight's horizon is deeper than that of intelligence. Policy and planning, the decision-making apparatus, are at the center of the system. Intelligence provides these types of information on generally predictable matters. Foresight provides these types of information on plausible matters. And intelligence and foresight work together, exchanging their products and leveraging each other's products in their own work. Policy and planning can contribute requirements and tasking to intelligence and primary areas of interest to foresight. Policy and planning produce decisions and actions, commonly called operations, as outputs. And these outputs feed back to intelligence and foresight, hopefully before they occur. And those decisions and actions, in combination with all the other relevant factors and conditions, result in outcomes, both intended and unintended. And these outcomes become elements of the horizon and thereby provide feedback, or in fact, feed forward to intelligence and foresight, thus completing the internally interactive and interdependent system. I hope that was reasonably clear. Okay, let's change lanes and talk about synthesis. As our existence has become more complex, more VUCAD, and continues to do so, our greatest vocational tendency, especially as individuals, has been to specialize into increasingly narrow and often isolated and disconnected areas of inquiry, technical tools, and knowledge. Expertise is certainly a way to contain and be effective at what one does, but it has its downside. One or even a few focused expert perspectives and information sets are almost never sufficient to understand, address, and solve any of today's big problems. There is a developing field of academic thought often called interdisciplinarity, usually focused on scientific research. A leading interdisciplinary studies group called Integration and Implementation Sciences, or I2S, operates out of the Australian National University. This word cloud, produced by I2S, contains the names of various approaches to tackling complex societal and environmental problems. Repeatedly, these approaches demonstrate and often invoke synthesis as a core process. Let's start by being clear about the nature of analysis. Here are some basic dictionary definitions, which I'm sure are familiar to you. So essentially then, analysis focuses on specific elements, features, or structures. Of course, analysis and intelligence work is a discipline and more formally defined. Here's a generally acceptable definition from a group called Recorded Future, dated 2009. So, what is synthesis? Here are a few definitions of synthesis from the Merriam-Webster dictionary, which is fairly common. Note in the C definition that synthesis is both a process and a product of such a process. Here's the second part of that definition. Note that deductive reasoning is considered to be a synthesis process, and deductive being reasoning from the general to the specific. However, while deductive reasoning might be a synthesis, not all synthesis is necessarily deductive. It can be inductive or even abductive, especially when related to intelligence work. Fundamentally, synthesis is not simply summarizing, piling on, or pooling. Synthesis is the act of combining elements, including facts and frameworks, to form something new. That something new is more than just a simple sum of the parts that went into it. Now, we use synthesis, at least informally and mostly unconsciously, in our everyday lives. Visual perception in the brain is organized hierarchically, from minimal features to full images. The left side of most human brains uses a feature analytic processing strategy, but the right side uses what's called a gestaltic, or all-at-once strategy. And we used to call the left hemisphere verbal and the right hemisphere spatial. But the two generally work together to try and make sense of everything. And as we navigate each set of circumstances, we take in a great deal of information and synthesize an overall I am here appreciation of it all. When doing things like buying a car, most of us explore available models, prices, options, appearances, and consumer reviews, and compare them for the models in contention. And those of us who interact well with other people use synthesis to try to understand them from their perspective and integrate that into our own thoughts and feelings. And we also use synthesis in our work, although not necessarily in a disciplined way. And there are several synthesis methodologies, tools, and techniques, some of which I'll mention later, but it's more than those. Synthesis is generally interdisciplinary. It is simultaneously organized and integrated. And to do synthesis well, one needs to be able to understand many types of quantitative and qualitative analysis methodologies and the results. It needs to be able to speak and listen to specialists in their own languages and synthesize what they provide into the language of the decision makers. Now, here I've attempted to capture in one sentence the essence of synthesis as a discipline. I'll give you a moment to walk through that. It is a mouthful, but I think it encompasses what we talk about when we talk about synthesis as a discipline. So synthesis identifies and uses principles, rules, and relationships to construct arguments or interpret facts, data, or other information. It uses logic and judgments. It identifies and reconciles gaps, uncertainties, and key assumptions of data. It integrates evidence or other information, evaluates and prioritizes alternatives, and assesses similarities and differences in data to develop findings and conclusion. And fundamentally, it understands potential implications of these findings or conclusions. Now, this is out of my intelligence days. This is an enhanced representation of the intelligence cycle, so-called. And I'm sure you'll see it parallels with processes in other analytic problem-solving disciplines. Synthesis is most important at both the beginning and the question asking or problem setting stage, and at the end of such a cycle. If one doesn't get the question right, there's little hope of producing an effective intelligence answer. Getting the question right requires the synthesis of often numerous inputs. And let's look at it this way. Notional curve of the relative analysis and synthesis processes distributed across the intelligence cycle. Even report production and dissemination involve a fair amount of synthesis to get them right. An analysis produces facts. Synthesis produces coherent assessments of those facts. In other words, analysis produces the detailed what, including where, when, why, how. Synthesis answers the so what. Now, in 2005, Joseph Voros published a seminal paper, a generic Foresight process framework. In it, quoting Mintzberg before him, he tells us that strategic thinking is about synthesis. It involves intuition and creativity to formulate an integrated perspective or vision. It is generally intuitive, experimental, and disruptive, and attempts to go beyond what purely logical thinking can inform. And because information about potential futures is always incomplete, the thinking required for success in this activity needs to be synthetical and inductive rather than analytical and deductive. He goes on to say that foresight then is an aspect of strategic thinking meant to open up an expanded range of perceptions of the strategic options available so that strategy making is potentially wiser. Foresight is concerned with exploration and options, not with the steps needed for the implementation of actions, which is the realm of strategic planning. Foresight is intuitive, disruptive, and what if. In other words, foresight is synthesis. And here's a quote from 2013 I2S paper that clearly indicates that we are still in the early stages of formal methodology development and standardization for synthesis as a discipline. This doesn't mean there aren't any methodologies. Here are several, many of which have been developed within the medical and health service fields. And they're quite a bit ahead of others in this respect. As you would realize, medical specialization and subspecialization are at pretty extreme levels. So diagnosing and treating the patient successfully very often requires a considerable amount of synthesis. Those in the intelligence arena aren't totally without recourse to methodologies. These were developed or adopted as part of the so-called structured analytic techniques endeavor, begun around the turn of the century. However, they're actually synthesis techniques rather than analysis ones. Even so, we still have a long way to go before intelligence professionals are comfortable with synthesis as a distinct discipline and with effective formal methodologies for doing it. Voros provided this framework model showing the strategic foresight process from inputs to outputs, with the latter feeding into the organization's policy and planning processes to produce strategy. And note the highlighted tools and techniques down the right side. Expanding on those three foresight stages, we can include these further tools and techniques for what Voros calls analysis, interpretation, and prospection.
You've just passed the 45-minute, John.
Okay, I'm getting there. So I've been involved throughout my career in several foresight efforts in the Canadian government and elsewhere, including for the Bank of Canada. However, my main efforts with respect to foresight have been directed at developing long-term organizational capacity in several places. I won't provide any more specific examples of this work here, as it was generally of a sensitive nature, and there are many published articles by very capable foresight practitioners on such activities and their outcomes around the world. I do want to provide a couple examples of my use of synthesis. The first of these relates generally to my strategic intelligence work in the Canadian government, and specifically to my time at the Integrated Threat Assessment Center, or ITAC. I was seconded to ITAC as the financial intelligence expert, but soon found the wealth of different perspectives and sources of information broadened my purview immensely, placing the financial intelligence to which I had access in a much broader context, sometimes even making it irrelevant to a question. And my products reflected this. I was able to craft my intelligence questions in a far more holistic way and call upon information from any and all of the intelligence domains, from human intelligence to imagery intelligence and beyond. One of my products was this study, which reconceptualized the narrowly defined area of terrorist financing to one of terrorist resourcing, going well beyond the obtaining, moving, and holding of money to the overall picture of how terrorists and terrorist organizations get the things they get to do the things they do. After I did this, I and others were able to apply the terrorist resourcing concepts and model to a range of terrorist groups. I was later called upon to provide relevant information as expert testimony to Canada's Commission of Inquiry into the investigation of the 1985 bombing of Air India Flight 182. In an unusual bout of effusiveness, the head of intelligence at ITAC once called me his best analyst. If that was true, then his best analyst was a synthesist. More recently, I've been following, with my Foresight hat on, the many threads of technological development converging towards plausible futures of human nervous system augmentation. And the myriad developments in different expert areas required to achieve real results are individually very fascinating, all the way from truly understanding how the brain works through nanotechnology, biological chips, to how to derive a usable energy supply from body heat or movement. And watching them converge, quite without most people actually noticing, is marvelous, bordering on frightening. On the other hand, if given the time and support to come to fruition, this convergence could plausibly lead to what we might call a new stage of human evolution. The terms commonly used for this type of development are brain-machine interface or brain-computer interface. However, I submit that a very plausible outcome will be a brain-computer-brain interface, and people would be using it to do much more than play ping pong or massively multiplayer online role-playing games. Another aspect of this convergence is exemplified by Jeremy Rifkin's book and other works generally called the empathic civilization, the achievement of which, he says, and I agree, is the only way our civilization can survive. There are echoes of this thesis in Julian Cribb's assertion that we must change from a leadership driven by the male competitive mindset to one that is driven by a female one, centered on widely shared empathy. Unfortunately, we're running out of time to make the changes that Rifkin and Cribb describe, and we seem to be heading in the wrong direction on many of them. The technological developments I mentioned, while advancing rapidly, still have a distance to go. And there are many who, from selfishness or fear, will strive to prevent them from reaching fulfillment. So that, as they say, is that, barring a few final points. The existential problems we face are not static, neither are there possible solutions. So they require constant feedback, continuous assessment, and frequent adjustment of our strategies. Foresight is more than occasionally raising one's head and glancing around. We have to more rapidly increase our development of foresight practitioners and inclusion of effective foresight programs in public and private sector organizations. In this world, we found that there are very few professional synthesists. We need more, but many potential synthesists face the daunting world of experts, much in the same way that left-handed people struggled so much in our right-handed world not so long ago. And a colleague in Boston, Bruce Toe, and I have recently formed the International Synthesis Society as a vehicle for professionalizing the practice of synthesis. In doing so, we're addressing synthesis identification, training, and accreditation. We have a long way to go, but we're determined and hopeful. And with that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, John. I must confess you've given me now some understanding of your topic. And I hadn't realized, but after 38 years in the Navy, I had used synthesis and foresight many times, not identified by those terms, but anyway, I do now understand it better. So thank you. So we have some questions, and so I'll ask Peter McKinnon for the first one, and Art, you're on standby.
Hi, Peter.
Thank you. I'm just trying to find my question. Well, actually, I had my first entry in the chat was a comment, so I better skip here. Question. Yes, here. Thanks very much, John, for your presentation. I do also work within the framework of Foresight as the chair of the Foresight Synergy Network at the University of Ottawa, where I stepped into the shoes of Jack Smith to take over his role because of his health.
And we
So my question
crossed
is,
paths there. Yes.
yes, my question is, what is the, and I noticed you used this after I posed the question, but what is the role of weak signals and nudges in your views of Foresight?
Well, one of Foresight's roles is to sensitize those in the other areas to the possibility of the plausibility of such things occurring, and also to provide mechanisms for detecting and identifying and responding to them when they occur. I often use the image of a radar operator sitting in front of a radar screen. That's a domestic aircraft. Well, there's one of our fighter planes. There's a flock of birds, and I don't recognize that. What Foresight serves to do is to help people imagine and articulate what something that they haven't seen might look like, and to see the weak signals that might indicate they're coming. Wild cards are problematic, but that's also an area of Foresight. I find more and more, though, that Foresight questions often even deal with what we might call gray rhinos, things that are in the room, and if you ask the right question, you'd actually see them, but they're missed by decision makers and others quite often because, I don't know, maybe they don't want to, but Foresight has that sort of, lose this narrow framework you're using for a time being and ask the what if questions. And as we've seen, Peter, quite often Foresight says, let's look at the world as it might be out there, and then work our way back as to what the conditions and the sequence of conditions might have been to get there. That helps us to say, well, do we see anything that looks like that? And I'm sure that my question is not news to you, but hopefully a good answer to your question.
Good. Yes, thank you very much. And thank you
Thanks,
for your
John.
presentation.
Thank you.
So Art, your question, and Peter Menke, your standby, please.
Okay, I'm just a little concerned by your presentation, and you said you cannot violate some non-disclosure agreements and what have you, but I'd be very interested in knowing or trying to understand a concrete example of what you've done in establishing a Foresight group in Canada. And is it still functional? And is it producing good results, or do you know?
Well, that last part helps me. Okay, as I briefly mentioned to you, Art, my work with the Bank of Canada was to establish a Foresight unit at their invitation. We did so by employing people in their security and intelligence area, and going through various training and other procedures to properly situate them and prepare them for doing this work. And then I and a couple other fellows in Ottawa took them through a full day of a Foresight exercise involving several decision makers and influencers of decisions, and with a fair amount of acclaim at the end. In that, is it still operating? I'm not sure, Art. When I left the arena, as it were, I kind of left behind a lot of things. I kept contact with some of the people for a while, and they continued to train and do stuff, but I have lost contact with that. So, and I won't say any more anyway, but yes, we did, and we've done. And one of the constant discussions in the Foresight arena is how to bring Foresight in, not as a one-off, but as an ongoing programmatic element within public sector organizations, at least. I've put up a paper, a journal article in the journal Foresight on how that can work, and I won't go through all the detail here. But Foresight, by definition, is disruptive, and decision makers and other people in, I don't want to be too pejorative, but in their nice little comfortable areas, aren't all that keen to have disruptions. But disruption is so important now because we are seeing things coming over the horizon very quickly that aren't anticipated by our current structured systems. So the model I propose, which is in place in several places, in particular in Singapore, I bow down to Singapore for its development of Foresight government-wide and in business in integrated fashion, but in a way that doesn't take over, but provides that support, that mutual support that I showed earlier.
I'm just thinking that must give you great pride to see that some of the systems that you helped establish are still functional. And
yeah, well, I was also riding on the shoulders of giants, I have to say. Singapore did it quite without my prompting, and others, and that. But Foresight's been one of these almost faddish things considered by decision makers. And when the budgets get tight, it's the kind of thing that gets dropped off. It's a problem, and you know, decision makers. You know, I once had a CEO that said, "John, you ask too many questions. You shouldn't rock the boat." And yet, God, you know, when we look at those problems we've been talking about in this nice cozy group and some others. When we say they're catastrophic and existential, we're not. It's true, you know. So we really do need to rock the boat, and we need to bring in this kind of, not just saying what can we see, but what if this happens, and what does it mean, and that, and so.
Yep.
Da-da-da.
okay, thank you.
Thanks. So, John, that sort of reminds me, unless you have to shoot me after you tell me, could you relate some of the general subjects you might have addressed working for the Attorney General in Alberta or for the federal government, just in general terms? Give us some idea of the application and the depth.
Well, in Alberta, I was originally hired for something called the Project Omega, the project to end all projects. And basically, it was a project to redesign the court system to make it operate more efficiently and, in fact, more effectively. And we started with the provincial courts and then went up into the higher courts. And it spent quite a while rebuilding. One of the things I was hired originally, what was called a methods and procedures analyst. So I took these, I don't know, meter wide sheets of graph paper, and I put down every document, every step, every decision that was being made as a process. And we did systems analysis on that, and then actually did one for Edmonton and one for Calgary. And they were different, which is interesting. And then we did working with the people in the court system, and not just in those two cities, but across the province, and did a redesign. We were also bringing in people called hearing officers, who are justices of the peace, who could handle provincial statute offenses and the like outside of the court system. And so there was a great deal of work being done. Anecdotally, after all this was being done, and we were running the pilot in Calgary after we rebuilt the whole thing and done all this and everything was operating, I happened to be standing near the reception desk, and the person came in and asked for a particular form. And I have to say that my mind raced, because I did not recognize the name of that form, and couldn't see it anywhere in the system that we had just spent so long going through. And so I called one of the officers over, and I said, person's asking for this form, but we have such a thing. She says, oh yeah, it's right here. She pulled it out from a bottom shelf and put it up on. So with all that work, we still missed something, but no, we did that. And I went from there into organizational development throughout the province. And worked with our systems analyst people and did other things. Then came to Australia and worked for the Attorney General here in law enforcement coordination. By the way, in Alberta, we also put in computer-assisted case management system, which was interesting. We had to sell the judiciary, the prosecution, and the defense on that. And I have to say, I learned a lot about diplomacy and about having an edge, as it were, to get decisions made. But yeah, anyway, I don't know. Did I answer enough of your question?
You did, thank you. I don't know if it's relevant, but I'm kind of interested in why Edmonton and Calgary what factors would make them different as an Albertan. I'm sort of perplexed by that, other than the nearness to the mountains.
Well, can I say it wasn't my decision, but they did everything. So we had to build based on generally on those. But as I said, I spent time with a lot of court officials and others in other parts of the province, both in developing, but particularly in the testing of this, all the way to Fort McMurray and all these wonderful places. But we built the model based on Edmonton and Calgary because they did everything.
Right. Thanks, John. So Peter, you're next, and Dave, you're on standby.
Okay, thanks very much. That was a wonderful, very, very insightful talk. I learned a lot. Dave Harries and I have been doing a bit of foresight for a number of years.
Yes.
The latest exercise that we've undertaken, and this perhaps is not at the high level that you've been operating at, but it's still something that we thought was necessary. We are trying to conduct a foresight exercise for the Royal Commonwealth Society of Canada. And this is why I ask about who should participate in this.
Yeah.
because we have several branches. And if you think Edmonton is different from Calgary,
Yeah.
certainly Vancouver is different from Halifax and Toronto. And each branch, of course, has its own view of what it wants to do, and they're completely independent and quite able to go ahead and do what they want. And that independence is something that we want to preserve in anything that comes out of this. But I have got a number of people, I've actually formed four groups rather, and trying to look at four scenarios, if you like. But I find the problem is, who do you choose to participate in this when nobody's had any exercise, experience in doing a foresight exercise? Do you have to have a whole series of lectures on foresight exercise before, or what? And is it, how do you go about that? Or
Okay.
that's my question.
You raised several things, Peter. The main question you ask is, how do you get people in the room? Okay, I have, quite to the chagrin of senior executives, in foresight and in strategic planning processes, said, I want as much representation as possible across the organization.
Mm-hmm.
We need as many perspectives in here as we can get. And when we get in the room, we don't have hierarchy. The other thing that I think is very important is we don't want a bunch of head nodders. We want people who will hear something, think about it, think, okay, does this make sense to me? If not, what is the question? And come back. And it's always good to have somebody, usually sits in the farthest back table, who says, ain't gonna work, Yeah. And what you try to do, not so much to directly change this person's mind, but you get the other people at the table they're working and they're seeing how this works and they're doing this, and they say, actually it does. And some of one of the best foresight operations is in the US Coast Guard. And they've been doing it for years, and they've really done well. And they make a practice, not just of running annual processes on a wide scale, but they rotate people out of the operating areas into their foresight unit. And they bring them in, and these people go from, so what's this Mickey Mouse stuff, to real advocates and ambassadors, and they go back out to their work. And that's the other thing, is foresight isn't just about running processes and stuff like that. It's about changing the mindset of the people throughout an organization to ask those questions on a daily basis, and not to ignore things that don't fit in their nice little framework, but to have their antenna out, their feelers out for this sort of thing. So getting people in the room, if you get a bunch of people who, took a short course on something called foresight, and they come in and everybody's hunky-dory and ready to go, that you're wasting your time.
Okay.
See, I'm trying to think of there was another part of your question and just point that education. No, you don't want a bunch of, look, foresight people are not the answer people. They're methodologists, okay? And you and others are so well practiced at the methodology, but the methodology is an enticement for people to learn. And so, and some people who are really good at this used to be, and I'm hoping still, Conference Board of Canada in running foresight programs. Trying to remember his name now. Fellow we brought in from the UK. Oh, anyway, I can't remember his name, but he was with the Conference Board of Canada for the longest time, and he'd run these things, and he'd bring in people from different agencies and places, including the guy at the back of the room who said this will never happen. And you walk you through it and you say, well, now we're going to do this. And here's the question we're going to ask. Now I want you to, I don't want you to do anything else. I want you just to do this. And at the end of the day, you had people who said, well, okay, that was interesting. And I can go back and learn some more. Because the first time you bring people through, you usually end up with a result. But what you hopefully ended up with is people who are ready to ask more questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, because as so many organizations in the Commonwealth, as you know, is facing a lot of different things now with CANSYNTH and various threats and opportunities, and we want to make sure that the Royal Commonwealth Society is geared to deal with these. Thank you very much.
That's it, but you reminded me of the other part of your comment, the diversity in approaches and the independence. I guess, and it's interesting. I once sat in the room with the deputy CEO of an organization, and she said, "So, John, how do we measure our performance?" And so I thought about it for about 2 seconds and questioned whether it was a trick question. And I said, well, ma'am, first we have to write down and consolidate what your objectives are. And her eyes lit up. And she said, what a great idea. And I thought, holy, we are in trouble, because this person doesn't realize that you start out with your common objectives, however you want to call them, your goals, what's the what is it you're trying to achieve with this organization? With my organizational development hat on, I always get concerned when a part of the organization, or more than one part, wants to run off in a different direction. But if different areas can move towards the same agreed, accepted, and promoted objectives by different methods, why not? And why can't they learn from one another, rather than being a basis of conflict or disagreement? These can be opportunities for experimentation and learning and developing in the organization, as long as they do not run counter to the overall agreed objectives. Once they start doing that, then you're creating your own problems, right? And as you've seen. So does that make sense?
Yes, very much so. Thank you. That's very helpful.
Thanks, Pierre. David, Doherty, and
Hi.
Steve Fanjoy, you're on in the reserve position.
Thanks, Ted. I wanted to make an observation first, which is that the story about the form in Alberta seems to be an example of an unknown known, a term that's new to me as of today, I must admit. I want to offer this. I can think of some situations where I don't think there was foresight. The Dieppe raid, the demise of the Avro Arrow, the Challenger explosion, and what's happening in our hospitals today when it's the same in virtually every province, but in Ontario, our premier promised to end hallway medicine, and it's actually probably twice as bad as it was in the previous administration. I wonder if you could offer to us one or two more examples of situations where foresight actually resulted in discovering something major.
It's funny, Dave, you mentioned there are so many examples of where politicians and senior bureaucrats and whoever just refuse to look beyond this, what is good right now, in my opinion, and that's what I'm going to do, and stuff like that. I'll bring out the old sawhorse, Royal Dutch Shell. In a time of great petrochemical production prosperity, did a foresight exercise, one of the first documented ones, that said, so what if this doesn't continue? What if, well, what could happen? What could go wrong? What could go wrong? And they went through this exercise, and I wasn't there, so I can't give you the rope and detail, but they went through it and they said, so if this happened, what would we do? And that's the thing. The military, by the way, is really good at what they call tabletop exercise, which is you're getting as many people around the table as you can, and you put out a set of conditions, and you say, so what would you do? And if they did that, what would you do? And all that stuff. And we hear a lot about small groups in the desert in Northern Africa. A military commander whose intelligence says the enemy's over that hill there. And he goes, okay, well, I'm going to concentrate my forces on there. And the intelligence wasn't entirely correct. And actually the enemy is over there. You're in trouble, right? So they try to teach people to think in terms of, so what is my main strategy, but what do I do if? And that's what Royal Dutch Shell did. It didn't change its main strategy at that point, but it had on the shelf, ready to use, options and decisions when something happened. And when things changed, they were the first to capitalize on the change, and they prospered when other was going down. Good examples. I don't know. Right now, my mind's a blank, and I'm sure others are popping with ideas about good examples of this. But it does work because the organization, if it preconceives plausible futures and what it would do in those cases, can be quite agile and actually survive these changes. By the way, I have practiced and done a fair amount of foresight work. I did a pro bono for an organization here. Was a not-for-profit that was going down the tubes, mostly because it had sub-organizational units that were running in different directions, and the people doing this particular task didn't think that these people were of any importance, and and all that. So I took them through a really hard day doing a basic foresight exercise, some scenarios and conditions, and even did a force field analysis with them. And at the end of the day, they were exhausted, but they had bits and pieces, and that organization survived and is now prospering. Did I make that happen? I don't know. But I think that ability to think in real resolution ways rather than quick fixes contributed to their survival and their prospering.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So the last question is to my former neighbor in Halifax many years ago, but when he had hair, Steve Fanjoy.
Thank you, Ted. Yeah, but I had no facial hair at that point. I was
No,
quite
that's true. That's true.
young. And I'm not losing hair, I'm saving face. That's what's happening. So thank you, John. It was a fascinating presentation for me. My role is not in the world of public sector foresighting, and certainly not in intelligence, but I come from the private sector world, a career in strategy, but a mind that's predisposed to thinking in more, I would say, in more foresight scenarios and longer term complex developments in markets and things like that. So I find all of this very fascinating. So I'm not sure I have well formulated questions, rather than I want to ask you to comment on some things. So one, it seems to me that the role of synthesis is always important, but perhaps the context where speed of decision is a variable, that synthesis becomes much more valuable. So if you can comment on synthesis when the decision environment requires speed, and you've got all of those other uncertainties, and maybe the benefit of past work on foresight and intelligence. So that would be one, and probably the easiest one to tackle. The other one is, this whole world of intelligence and foresight analysis and synthetic reasoning. It's predisposed to thinking that the key decisions that influence markets or societies or the world are made on the basis of reason. All of this good work can take place from a national perspective or what have you, and then it runs into decision makers that are grounded in interests, whether they're political or industrial or corporate, and all seem, use just the recent COP as an example, where over 600 industry lobbyists were present at the COP27. We look at the now 3 decades of failure of global governance around climate change, and most of us would find inescapable the conclusion that industry is driving what is and is not happening. So that whole sort of interface between, if you can comment on the interface between knowing what to do because of the resources and disciplines of intelligence and foresight and such, when it comes down to the deciders acting on the basis of interest. I realize that's part of the complexity, but it's also at the fundamental core of whether or not we can affect those, change those big threats and risks that the world is facing.
Yeah. Perceived self-interest is an interesting thing. And by the way, Stephen, I hope I included the private sector frequently enough for you to consider included. I do come from a public sector arena, but this is equally important there. A couple things. Current situation here is that the federal government in Australia is bringing about price caps on petrochemical energy sources. And it's not easy. It's funny. It's, the war profits that the petrochemical companies have been reaping here because we had no price caps, except in Western Australia, which is doing quite well. Thank you very much. Is astronomical. And so the government says, well, we should really, stop these wild prices going up simply for your pockets. And so they're bringing in this, and the lobby, the millions and millions of dollars that are going into trying to prevent this happening are incredible. So it's all about me and my immediate profit. And of course, if you convert that into a political system, what's politics about? We'd like to think it's about governance, but it's actually about getting elected. So as we've seen in the not so properly working electoral system south of you, this can go sideways sometimes. So the interface between personal interest, even to the exclusion of one's children and grandchildren and stuff, is interesting. That is one of the biggest challenges there is, and that is goes along with the misinformation and, in fact, conscious disinformation that's out there and what have you. That is a real problem. I just want to go back to your point about decision makings and the speed of decisions. Foresight, as I've said, and synthesis should not be considered as incidental things to be brought to bear, when as absolutely desperate. They should be continuing, programmatic, always there, always producing elements of your program and strategic and in fact operational tactical planning. They should be available to you as a decision maker, and it's on that basis that you should be able to make those decisions. I mean, Foresight's geared to be making it possible for one to make a decision quickly because you've already decided it based on your foresight of plausible futures. And when something comes up out of the weeds that was not predicted but plausibly looked at, you're ready to make that decision. Synthesis is not something that everyone does and not something that everyone should do. We need the expertise because there's such a wide range of very focused subjects and all that. But we need to be constantly synthesizing from those and having a process of doing so to say, so what's the big picture? A lot of decisions are made, someone says, oh, look, there's a squirrel, and we all jump on it. And in fact, the squirrel was going over the cliff and we just followed it. I mean, I think my answer is to take it out of the urgency of an immediate situation and say, make it not urgent. Make it so that you've already looked at the possible decisions here. Did I cheat? Maybe. Did I get far enough into your? I really enjoyed your comments, and I'm not sure I responded.
It was more, yeah, I guess it was more of an invitation to comment. But your point about foresight and intelligence and analysis and synthesis being a program, something that's constant, so that as complex situations emerge, better decisions hopefully can be made. My question about interest was not so much at a personal level, but more at the at the more macro level. So, for example, not obviously, because most would not think of it this way, but yeah, governance in a democracy is about parties gaining power, and once they gain power, it's about gaining it the next time, and that is the beginning, middle, and end of the lens through which decisions are made. And at the, obviously at the, with topics like climate change, we have interests that have long played out. So, one could argue that the very tools of foresight and intelligence and scenario and synthesis are all being used to game against the interests of, for example, the fossil fuel industry, and hence that's how they react. So I just wonder, I totally agree and have been doing a fair bit of thinking recently about looking through the world, especially the human related world, through a complex systems paradigm. And it's I have a hard time seeing how we navigate the challenges that we're facing.
Well, just may go back to Julian Cribb's writings. I don't know if he's on here today,
No.
But anyway, Julian talks a lot about the problems we face. But Julian always ends up on solutions. And I think that's the thing. We need to act. Taking a different track. You mentioned the politics and the nation state and the self-interest. We haven't got democracy right yet. Maybe someday we will. Maybe in that little scenario I painted as one of my examples, where we can actually interact on levels far better than ones we have now. I'm one of the people who believes that the evolution from the individual to the family to the tribe to the kingdom to the city to the country is, nation state to me is dead, and we're just seeing it kicking about and flailing and whatever in its death throes. If we do not start thinking globally, Julian talks and others talk about the mass migrations that are already occurring, but are only going to increase as some of these problems really hit home. So all of us, look, I'm really comfortable here in Canberra. It's a little chilly today, but I couldn't be in a better place. But and Australia is this island continent. It's got nice water around it and everything like that. It's going to affect all of us. And those of us who are complacently sitting there saying, well, I'm fine, are fooling themselves. And the politicians and the people who are making their millions and billions now off the backs of these things that are fighting against progressive thinking, and it's frustrating. Sorry. By the way,
Thanks, John.
Ted, I just don't. Somewhere along the line, I saw a comment on my screen from Phil talking about competing conversations about foresight. If not now, I would like to work more into what that was about. But anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
So I have a comment from, we all know David Harries, who's actually a graduate of RMC like myself in art and others. And he spoke to KCOR not long ago again. And so he's left a comment. He had to leave about 30 minutes ago, but he says, in my experience, foresight does not always find something major, but I could not remember an exercise in nearly 40 years of doing foresight in which the process did not make me a wiser person, because a good foresight process is, as John superbly explained, synthesis, which is inherently inclusive of all participants' biases, assumptions, and interests. Unfortunately, due to family circumstances, I have to leave the appointment. Thank you, John. Great talk, David. I just wanted to pass that on. So we've sort of run out of time, but may I ask our KCOR chair, Jean Doherty, to make her closing remarks.
Before you do that, Ted, in the slides and elsewhere, and if you look up, if you Google search CANSYNTH, you only find only me, and I am quite willing to correspond and continue conversations. It's the presentation's all that fun and everything, but for me, the big thing is that discussion that occurs afterwards, and I learned so much. So anybody online, please feel free to write to me however you can reach me. Sorry, Ted.
No, thanks. Jean, over to you.
Thank you, Ted. And John, thank you very, very much for an absolutely wonderful presentation. You've taken a very complicated topic and you've made it simple, especially by using the examples. And as the KCOR president, it is my privilege to have the opportunity to say thank you on behalf of all of the members of the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome. So thank you for this. It's been interesting to listen to you.
Thank you, Jean.
And for those of you who are still online, I'd like to encourage you to visit our website, canadiancore.com. On that particular site, if you go and log in and sign up for the Stay Informed section, you will actually be given our weekly newsletter that shows all of the new things that have gone onto our website, including the link to this particular talk, and looking at all the previous talks that we have had on our Zoom series and other things before that. So please go to our website and look for that information. And also, if you're interested in becoming a member of KCOR or want to find out more about KCOR, you'll find that on our website as well, information on how to become a member, as well as if you are just interested in making a donation, you're welcome to do that as well. And that information is on our website. So if you've gone on to our YouTube and look at various things, it's also, if you subscribe, you will be getting all of the links to those particular talks as well. So there's a lot of opportunity for getting a lot more information. And again, thank you very much, John, for a wonderful presentation.
My pleasure.